Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 2.24, and in this lesson we're going to add one more piece to our live setup puzzle, and really this is our cherry on top, if you will. We're going to talk about using an effect track inside of Bitwig so that we can send our signal through a little bit of a delay and a reverb, and then have the ability to filter out that sound that we're able to generate. So I want to start by, again, opening up our effects layer. And what we have are different chains we could use to process our signal. So if I wanted to, I could add in here a reverb, for example. And let's just open up and find a preset that we like. I don't know, what about hall, wide, bright, and big? Lots of fun going on. So first and foremost, whenever you're processing through either an effects layer or an effects track, which I'll show you, it's pretty important that you make sure that that affected signal is going to be 100% wet, assuming that you have dry signal coming through. And in our case, we do have dry signal coming through. We have our, just by default, this EQ DJ and everything, it's running our track just as it would normally be. So with the reverb, if I turn this all the way down, we're not going to hear it coming out of the reverb, but we'll still hear our normal track. So I'm just going to go ahead and click play here. And I'll fade this up. I'm just going to add more reverb time so you can really hear this. So that is our track 100% wet with the reverb. If we were to mix this back to say like 50-50, we're going to be getting some original signal, but in that case, we're basically just doubling up our original signal because it's already coming through the EQ filter chain. So I'll show you what I mean if I play it. So we're adding a whole lot of extra signal, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we already have our original signal processing here. So I am going to want to turn this mix up 100%. So if I solo it, you can hear some of that original signal. And then that's with full-blown reverb on. So I could mix between the two if I wanted to add some reverb to this signal. All right, it's really not that important if I'm in here messing around because this is not what we're going to be doing. But really, our effects layer is exactly the same thing, or excuse me, our effect tracks are exactly the same thing as adding a new layer inside of this container. The only difference is that we can send multiple tracks to that effect. So right now, I can only control deck 1 with this reverb, but maybe I'd want to also send deck 2 to the same reverb, right? And to do that, we're going to use our effect track. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this. And to show our effects tracks, I'm just going to click this last button right here, this little tab, and there are effect tracks. And I've already made the one that we're going to be using. I'll walk you guys through it. But you can easily just create an effect track by right-clicking and selecting Create Effect Track. Very simple. So here is one blank. We don't see anything. But notice right away, we have a couple of faders here. And these faders are going to determine how much level we're sending into the effect track. So I'll show you guys that right now. So let's add on another reverb. We'll go into our presets, pull up that same one we were just using, change my mix to 100%. And by default, when you bring something in to these effect tracks, I think it will automatically set your mix to 100%, which is very, very handy. And you saw when I brought it in inside this layer, it didn't do that by default. So I'm going to go ahead and play back. And I'm just going to increase the reverb time so you can really hear this. And now I'm going to take this and pull it up, and we're going to start to hear some reverb coming in. Okay, just to show you guys the example. Now, it's really easy, and it would make a lot more sense if we had a way we could control the send amount from our actual track from our little strip here. And we can do that. You're just gonna have to select this little tab icon here, which says Show Effect Send Amounts. So I'll select that. And now you see we have these two little knobs, and they're corresponding to our different effect tracks. And if I want to send into this reverb we just created, that's going to be the second one here, and I can play back. And now watch this icon and watch this knob as I turn it. Okay, so very, very simple stuff. It's working just so similar as the effects layer, only now if I was playing from this second track, I could also send it to the reverb. Okay, that sounds like a mess, but just to illustrate the point, you can see what's happening. Now, let's make an effect send for our tracks right now, for our DJ setup. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete this S2 reverb. And I've already created something, and this is what we're gonna be using. I'm just going to explain to you the logic for it. So I know that I'm gonna be messing with reverb for sure, because I wanna get a little bit of that distancy effect. I'd like to bring that in. But I don't really want it messing with my low frequencies. And the reason for that is because reverb on the low frequencies is going to really, really crowd your entire mix, because we know those low frequencies have further to travel, and reverbs are basically just a string of delays. So tons and tons of delays, at least in the plugin algorithmic sense, and even kind of in the real world too. Lower sounds are going to take up more of that space, longer wavelengths, and the reverb, the echoes, the delays are similarly going to take up more space. And so it can get really, really crowdy and muddy really quickly. So the first thing I just do is I'm bringing an EQ to just right at the source, cut that off. And right now, if we were to play back and we were to add some signal, all it's going to do is boost the relative volume level, only without the low end. So we can take a listen to that if we want. All right, that's really interesting, because as you bring it up, it basically just is losing power, but we're actually increasing level. Pretty cool, but we don't have any effect really going right now. The next thing I added was a delay unit. And just a simple delay 1, because I like when I'm throwing to reverbs, I kind of like having a really distinct echo, a really distinct delay. So I can turn that on. These are the settings I'm using, but feel free to adjust these to taste or use a preset for right now. Find something that you like. And let's go ahead and listen back with the EQ and the delay on. Again, my mix is up to 100%, very important. Let's stop it and hear the delay fade off. Okay, so that's really what the delay is doing here. Next, I'm adding in my reverb. So I want to go from the EQ, cutting off that low end, into the delay to give me some really distinct echoey type sounds, and then bouncing into a reverb, which is going to take the signal and really just add some space, add some width, give it a little bit more of that airy type quality. And I used a preset, and then I just kind of messed with the preset to get what I want. But for right now, if you don't really understand everything that's going on in the reverb, that's totally okay. Go ahead and pick a preset. And the one thing that you could just mess with is the reverb time. So you could bring that up a little bit if you want that trail to go on a little bit longer, so that it's really a extended reverb. So I'll show you guys what that sounds like now. I've brought in my reverb. So obviously it's going to sound a lot better on something that's not just a drum loop. So like right here with our little vocal part, this sounds really nice. And that's what the trail is, and that's what it sounds like. So the last thing I added on here is just a filter so that I can actually control exactly what's going on inside of this device, inside of just my send. So I'll show you guys and explain that to you right now. So if I'm playing back, and let's just crank it all the way up so we can really hear this. And maybe adding on like a pretty heavy distortion after this, you could do that as well. If you wanted to experiment and mess around with that, you could feel free to do it. Now we have controls here again, and if we wanted to, like I showed in the last video, we could map things. I'd probably map the cutoff, maybe the feedback here, maybe mess with the width parameter and the reverb. It's really up to you and what you want to experiment with and see what sort of sounds you get. So the last thing I wanted to show you is the difference between pre and post fader on this. For our purposes, it's not going to have as big of an impact because we've set this manually, and we're not really going to be messing with our main fader. But if we were, I'll show you what's going on. I'm going to open up the inspector panel, and here we have the ability to change our delay verb filter to either pre or post. Post is going to take into account your last filter setting here, or excuse me, your last volume setting here. So if I bring this down and we're playing back, you can hear that coming in. As I bring this down, it's going to also decrease the level of this. Okay, the difference is if I go with pre and I bring my level of my fader all the way down, it's actually not taking into account this volume fader. It's looking at right here, our last point in the signal chain, pre-fader. So we'll just listen to that and you'll see that as I pull this down, the volume of this isn't going to change. And eventually we can pretty much just solo out what's happening in our effect track. So let's take a listen to that. So that's actually incredibly helpful for when you're making a delay effect or you're making any kind of effect that's going to be sitting on an effect track here, because you can actually really solo out what you hear. You can't just click solo and hear what's happening without having to also have this soloed, but you can select and work in pre-fader mode and then just turn your fader all the way down, and then you'll be hearing exactly what's going on inside of your effect track there. For right now, we can go ahead and set it to post because it's not going to have that big of a difference because we're working with a fader in here and not our actual global fader. But I did want to show you guys the difference, and it can be very, very helpful to know. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and set this back to -5. And now in our DJ set, assuming we decide to map this to something, we have an additional effect that we can play around with. And I'd kind of encourage you to just map multiple parameters here to just one knob to make your life very easy, specifically messing around with this cutoff here. And obviously you're going to want to map this to a controller as well. So that is going to help quite a bit. So I'll just go ahead and map this right now to something just for fun. All right, lovely. So if we're playing back, we can slowly fade that in if we want to. And did this get flipped around? No, we're good. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and play back. Now I don't even remember what I mapped it to, but okay, so pretty simple, but definitely very, very powerful. And for right now, I'd encourage you to keep this as simple as possible. Don't add in way too many things before it gets overwhelming. I think this is a pretty easy chain to understand what's happening, and it gives us a whole lot more control and flexibility. And one of the joys of working in Bitwig Studio as compared to working in Traktor is that we have control over so many different parameters inside of each of these effects, where in a software like Traktor, or even in the hardware realm, you're not going to have all of those controls. You're going to be working a lot with what's built into the system itself. Sometimes that can be a blessing because it doesn't go way over your head, but at other times when you really start to understand all these effects, you're going to want to be able to control these things and create effects that are unique to you that not everybody else has access to. So thank you guys for watching this lesson, and in the next video, we're going to talk about a very simple little setup you can do so that if you wanted to, you could cue tracks back without having to play that to the house immediately. So we'll take a look at that in the next lesson. Thank you for watching, and you will catch me again then.